Forget everything you thought you knew about the Middle Ages. There are no knights in shining armor here, no scholars shaping the fate of the world. Here, there is only filth, hunger, disease, and the endless struggle for survival. Here, being a teacher of literacy is not a privilege or a path to enlightenment, but an endless sequence of humiliation, exhaustion, and fear. Do not expect gratitude. Your work will not bring you fame, and your students will disappear faster than the ink dries on old pages. But before you get comfortable, make sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and let me know in the comments which city you're watching from and what time it is where you are. I'm really curious to see who's joined us. Now, settle in. We're about to begin. The morning light barely slips through the grimy window of the small stone room. A thin layer of dust coats everything, a persistent reminder of the world outside. A world that doesn't care about you, your teaching, or your existence. But this is where you are, and this is where you'll stay for as long as fate allows. You are a grammar teacher in some distant, forgotten corner of medieval Europe, and though your work seems essential to a handful of illiterate peasants and farmers, it is as thankless and burdensome as the rest of life here. The world you inhabit is cold, wet, and miserable. The stone walls of your tiny room offer little in the way of protection from the chill of early morning. Your bed, a straw mattress on the floor, is no sanctuary either. It's often colder there than it is sitting at your small, splintered desk where your daily labor begins. There's a smell, the faint, ever present stench of sweat, earth, and smoke that clings to your skin like a second layer. The smell of a world that doesn't know and doesn't care to know any better. You are, as they say, a man of the book, or at least you're supposed to be. To those around you, you're little more than a curiosity, a peculiar individual who spends most of his days staring at marks on paper, speaking in languages that no one can understand. To them, you might be seen as an oddity, but it doesn't matter. You serve a purpose in this place, but it is a purpose that is not appreciated, not valued. Your life revolves around teaching what you've been taught. The ancient Latin, a language that you were expected to learn as part of your calling. It's a cumbersome task, but you've mastered it, or at least you've learned how to fake it well enough to get by. After all, who in this part of the world actually speaks Latin? No one, of course. But in your position, it's the language of the learned, the language of God, the language of the church. So you teach it day after day to children who would rather be anywhere but in your classroom. But what is it really that you're teaching them? The strange and clumsy grammar of a dead language, untranslatable to their lives. The children do not understand why they must learn this, and to be honest, neither do you. But it is your lot, your burden to bear, as the teacher of those who are bound to remain in their miserable lives, toiling in fields, herding sheep, and scraping together whatever scraps they can to survive. Your students are not the bright-eyed children of noblemen or wealthy merchants, whose futures lie before them like a road of golden opportunity. No, your students are peasants, the children of peasants, and their lives are already written. Some will die young, from disease, from hunger, from accident. Others will grow into the same bitter, weathered men and women that their parents were before them. There is no upward mobility here. The best they can hope for is that their children might one day escape the cycle of suffering. Your role as their teacher, as their guide to the mysteries of grammar and language, seems almost laughable in this context. You stand in front of them, your mouth dry from speaking words that mean nothing to them, words that are as foreign to their lives as the distant lands you've only heard of in the stories of wandering monks. They stare at you blankly, the occasional sneeze breaking the silence, while outside the cold wind howls against the wooden frame of the schoolhouse. But this is your reality, and there is no escaping it. You are a servant to the great cause of learning, though your own ambitions have long since been crushed by the weight of your duty. Your days blur together in a haze of scribbled lessons and repetitive tasks. And yet, you persist. You have no choice. In a world where the day is consumed by survival, where everything is a struggle, you cling to the small purpose you've managed to carve out for yourself. Every day, you rise before dawn. You light a meager fire in the hearth, trying in vain to stave off the cold. You eat what little is left of yesterday's bread, chew it without relish, and move to your desk. The first lesson awaits, and there's no turning back now. There are days when you wonder if your efforts make any difference at all. When you feel the weight of your own insignificance pressing down on you, you question the worth of it all. The endless recitation of verbs, the conjugation of tenses, the translation of sentences that seem to bear no connection to the lives of those you teach. But then, when your students stumble through their lessons, repeating after you like parrots, you remember why you do it. It is for them, the next generation, to help them understand the world through the narrow lens of grammar. In this world, you are nothing more than a cog in the machinery. You are not a hero, not a savior. You are just a teacher, and that is both your burden and your purpose. As you begin to organize your notes for the first lesson of the day, a knock on the door breaks your thoughts. The cold air rushes in as you open it, and standing before you is one of your students, a thin boy with a gaunt face, his eyes shadowed with hunger. He looks at you with a mixture of fear and expectation. Master, it's time for class, he says, his voice barely above a whisper. You nod, a tired smile tugging at your lips. It is time. Time to teach another lesson that no one will truly appreciate. But you do it because that is what you are meant to do. That is your place in this harsh, unforgiving world. And so the day begins. It would be a lie to say that you ever dreamed of becoming a grammar teacher. In this world, dreams are luxuries best reserved for those with full bellies and soft beds, people who have the freedom to dream at all. For the rest, for you, life is more a succession of desperate choices and reluctant resignations, shaped less by ambition than by what fate has not yet managed to take from you. Once, Long ago, or at least it feels that way, you were just another child scurrying through mud and filth, your hands chapped and raw from winter's cold. You remember the taste of stale barley bread, the ache in your stomach that never truly went away, the bruises that covered your shins from endless chores. You were not born into the small, miserable fraternity of those who could read and write. Your family, like all the others, could barely carve out a living from the stingy earth, and none had patience for book learning. But the plague, that all consuming shadow, swept through your village one spring. It took your father and your little brother first, then your mother, leaving you orphaned, a skinny, hollow eyed boy who learned very quickly that the world has no pity for the weak. You became a burden to your relatives, another mouth to feed when food was as precious as gold. They sent you to the church, and the church, in its boundless charity, fed you, barely, and put you to work. There, you learned your letters at the side of a silent, coughing monk whose main talent seemed to be surviving winters that killed the strong. You might have ended up as another half starved servant, sweeping floors in the abbey until you collapsed from exhaustion or consumption. But you learned quickly, and the abbot noticed. There is always a certain utility in a boy who can read Latin, especially when he can also clean up after the pigs. So you became, through no particular plan of your own, a student of letters. At first, you believed this might be a blessing. You imagined yourself someday growing into one of those remote figures who lived among books and parchment, eating white bread, never cold or hungry. Of course, reality had other plans. The Abbey Library was colder than any barn, and the food, when you got any, was even more meager than what your relatives had offered. You spent hours copying texts until your fingers bled, hunched over pages so filthy and battered that even the rats seemed uninterested in nibbling them. You listened to endless, droning sermons about the virtues of humility and suffering while your stomach grumbled in open rebellion. When you were old enough, the abbot, who had no real fondness for you, but had even less patience for ignorance among the villagers, suggested that you take up teaching the local children. There was no real choice involved. You were given a battered primer, a handful of charcoal sticks, and sent to a drafty shack at the edge of the village. Your salary was the occasional loaf of bread, the odd chicken or cabbage, or, when times were really bad, nothing at all. Sometimes, if you were lucky, the parents of your students would offer you a mug of watered beer or a strip of tough, salted meat, though more often than not, they eyed you with suspicion, as if you might corrupt their children with dangerous ideas. As you sit at your desk, staring at the cracked wall opposite, you cannot help but reflect on this winding, miserable road. Was it really a choice? Did you ever decide to be a teacher? Or did life simply shove you into the role, as it shoves everyone in this world, herds them, like stubborn cattle, into whatever corner is least occupied by wolves? Your profession does not inspire awe. No one in the village brags about knowing you. If you vanished tomorrow, the children would return to the fields, and no one would mourn the loss of your lessons in Latin grammar. Sometimes, late at night, you wonder if you might have been better off had you never learned to read. Ignorance is not only bliss, it is a powerful shield against the bleakness of reality. If you did not know there was another way to live, you could not miss it. But you are not ignorant. You have read about kings and saints, about ancient cities and miracles, about distant lands where the bread is soft and the wine flows freely. You know that the world is larger than this one mud-choked village, and that knowledge, it gnaws at you, a constant, bitter ache. You are chained to this place, not by force, but by the inertia of poverty, by the lack of options, by the simple truth that the world does not care about the ambitions of a penniless grammar teacher. Every day, you must convince yourself to keep going. You must swallow the resentment, the envy, the endless questions. You must look into the eyes of your students, some dull, some bright, all doomed to a life of hardship, and pretend that what you are teaching matters. You must hold on to the smallest hope that maybe, just maybe, a single child will remember a lesson, will find some tiny, flickering spark of meaning in the endless dark. And so you rise, and you teach, and you survive. Not because you chose this life, but because it is the only one you have. You wake each morning before the village rooster, not because you are eager for the day, but because the rats in the thatch above your head begin their dawn patrol with the relentless discipline of soldiers. Their tiny claws scratch at your sleep, reminding you that even here, in your so called teacher's house, you share your shelter with vermin. You shiver, pulling the rough blanket tighter around your shoulders, though it is riddled with holes and smells faintly of mildew. Your straw mattress sags beneath you, the straw long since flattened and laced with dust and bugs. It is a far cry from the soft feather beds you read about in Latin texts, where noblemen slumber away their evenings after banquets and wine. But this is your lot. You sit up and survey your domain, a single room with a dirt floor, a crooked desk pushed up against the wall, and a shelf bearing your most valuable possessions. A few battered manuscripts, some quills cut from goose feathers, a half empty bottle of ink, and a tallow candle gnawed by mice. On the rare occasion the wind is not howling through the cracks in the walls, you might almost imagine you are safe and warm. But those occasions are few, and even then, the silence only sharpens the sounds of your own stomach, forever grumbling its complaints. The fire in your hearth is more decorative than functional. Most mornings, it is only ashes and a vague scent of smoke, as wood is precious and best used for cooking gruel or boiling water to stave off the endless threat of dysentery. When you do manage to scrape together enough twigs and scraps to coax a flame, you hover over it like a moth, letting the faint heat soothe your numb fingers. Those fingers are stained with ink and cracked with cold, the skin peeling away despite your best efforts to keep them clean. Cleanliness is a losing battle. You live in dirt, you teach in dirt, and you eat food that often carries its own soil as seasoning. Your water, fetched from the muddy stream outside the village, must be boiled or risked as is, with all the microscopic dangers it hides. You wash your face with cold water each morning, hoping to look less like a ghost in front of your students, but there is no hiding the red, chapped skin or the dark hollows under your eyes. You dress in layers, not for fashion, but for survival. Woolen hose with holes at the knees, a linen shirt once white but now permanently the color of weak tea, a patched tunic, and a cloak so threadbare it does little to keep out the wind. On your feet, leather shoes, cracked and mended again and again until they are more patch than shoe. When it rains, and it often does, mud seeps through the walls and collects in little pools at your doorstep, so that even inside, you are never far from the earth that rules your existence. Breakfast is no grand affair. A piece of black bread, hard enough to break a tooth, with perhaps a scrap of cheese if you are lucky. More often, it is just the bread dipped in thin, sour ale to soften it. Meat is a distant memory from feast days or funerals when the whole village would share the spoils of a slaughtered pig, or less joyfully, a neighbor. Hunger is your familiar companion, gnawing at you as surely as the rats gnaw the edges of your books. You eat in silence, staring at the cold remains of the fire, your mind already running through the day's lessons. The children will come soon, trudging through the muck in twos and threes, each carrying whatever pitiful supplies their parents can spare. Some have slates, others bits of chalk, or even smooth stones on which to scratch their letters. You have long since given up expecting parchment. Real parchment is more valuable than gold here, reserved for contracts, sermons, and the endless records of births, deaths, and tithes. You gather your meager teaching tools, wrap yourself in your cloak, and step out into the world. The village is just waking, smoke rising from a few hearths, dogs barking at shadows, a rooster crowing his challenge to the eternal grayness of the sky. You nod to old Marta, the washerwoman, who eyes you with suspicion as if you might steal her laundry, and to Peter, the smith, whose children you will soon attempt to teach the mysteries of Latin declensions, though their minds are clearly more suited to the solid logic of iron and fire. Your schoolroom is another cold, drafty hut at the edge of the village green. Sometimes, if the weather is especially foul, you gather the children in your own home, where the smell of unwashed bodies mingles with that of boiled turnips and old ink. Discipline is less a matter of rules and more a contest of wills. You shout to be heard over their squabbles, resorting to a switch when patience runs out. Some days, your voice is hoarse before the sun has cleared the horizon. There is little privacy in this life. Everything you do is observed, discussed, and criticized by neighbors who suspect your books hide forbidden secrets, or who blame you when their children come home with headaches and inky fingers. You have been called a witch more than once, and though the priest vouches for you, you know better than to trust the shifting tides of village opinion. Today's teacher is tomorrow's scapegoat. Your health is forever in question. A cough lingers for weeks. Sores on your legs take months to heal. When the pox comes, You pray not for survival, but for a quick and merciful death. Most of the time, you just feel tired, bone tired, soul tired, tired in ways that sleep cannot fix. Still, you endure. You teach your lessons. You patch your roof. You scavenge for firewood. You remind yourself that somewhere in a distant city, teachers are respected, maybe even admired. You tell yourself this as you sweep mud from your floor, as you boil your bitter herbs for tea, as you lie in the darkness listening to the rats. Tomorrow will come, and with it, another day of surviving the only way you know how. You quickly learn in this life that your true enemies are not the wild animals that sometimes prowl at the village's edge, or even the occasional drunken lout who bangs on your door at night, demanding you teach his whelp how to sign a mark. No, the enemies that rule your days are older and far less visible: hunger and disease, each stalking the village with a patience that puts even the most relentless creditor to shame. You rise each morning with an ache in your belly, a gnawing hollowness that never really fades. Hunger is not an emergency here. It is a constant, woven into the fabric of existence. The soil gives grudgingly, rye and barley if the rains are kind, turnips and beans if not. In the best of years, you eat enough to feel half alive. In the worst, which come more often than not, you watch as even the children grow thin, and their eyes take on that empty, haunted look that tells you they have already learned the price of scarcity. Meals are grim affairs, stripped of any ceremony or joy. You find yourself scraping the last crumbs from a trencher or gnawing on a root so tough you suspect it was meant for the pigs. Meat appears only on festival days or in the aftermath of some disaster: a cow found dead in the mud, a goat that could not survive the winter. You have, more than once, eaten stew in which the main ingredient is hope. You notice the signs of deprivation everywhere: children whose bellies bulge, not with food, but with the swelling of hunger, elders who cough and wheeze and then one day simply do not wake up. You yourself grow thin, your ribs pressing against the inside of your shirt, your knees sharp as stones. When you catch your reflection in a puddle, you almost do not recognize the hollow face that looks back. Worse than hunger, though, is disease. Disease is always there, hovering in the stale air of the classroom, lurking in the dirty water, festering in the wounds that never quite heal. You try, sometimes, to wash your hands after lessons, scrubbing with cold water that stings your cracked skin, but the filth returns as quickly as you can wash it away. Each cough in the classroom makes your heart jump. Each rash or sore is a possible sentence of death. You have seen plagues pass through, as unstoppable as the winter winds. The lucky die quickly. The unlucky linger, burning with fever, soiling their beds with sweat, and worse, their cries muffled behind thin walls. You are called to read prayers over their bodies, and you see in the parents' eyes a mixture of hope and accusation, as if your knowledge of letters should somehow be able to fend off the black breath of death itself. When the sickness comes for you, it starts small: a tickle in the throat, a headache that lingers too long. You try to push through, knowing that if you stop teaching, you will not eat at all. But your body has its own agenda. Sometimes you cannot rise from your straw mattress for days, and the children are sent home to idle or toil in the fields. If you are lucky, you recover. If not, the village will simply find another soul desperate enough to take your place. You remember, with bitter clarity, the epidemic that swept through 5 winters ago. You can still see the rows of bodies laid out on straw mats in the church, the priest moving among them, swinging his censer with more desperation than faith. Some families lost every child. Some children lost every parent. The stench hung over the village for weeks, and for months afterward. The laughter of children seemed to have been banished. There are days when you suspect that you are kept alive more by spite than by medicine. There is a grim stubbornness in you, a refusal to give up even as your body protests each movement, each breath. You force yourself to eat, to drink, to keep teaching, if only to prove to the fates that you are not so easily broken. But the price is high. You grow old before your time. Your teeth loosen, your joints ache, and your eyes struggle to see the tiny letters on the page. There is little help to be found. The healer in the village is half blind and wholly superstitious. Her remedies a mixture of prayers, mud, and whatever weeds she can find by the roadside. You have drunk every foul tasting potion she has ever brewed, but you know that most diseases, once caught, run their course without regard for her muttered Latin or your desperate faith. The church preaches patience and endurance, but offers little else besides a few crumbs and the hope of paradise for those who die obediently. You learn to live with the ever present fear. You watch the children with a careful eye, noting the pallor in their cheeks, the tremble in their hands, the blankness that sometimes settles in their gaze. When one fails to show up for class, you fear the worst. When a mother comes to your door, wringing her hands and begging you to pray for her daughter, you hide your dread behind a mask of solemn piety. In the cold, in the hunger, in the shadow of disease, you find your daily existence pared down to the simplest acts: breathing, teaching, eating, sleeping. The great dreams of your youth have long since shriveled, replaced by the bare hope that you will see another sunrise. You count the days not in lessons taught or books copied, but in breaths drawn, in meals endured, in plagues survived. Here, in the darkness of medieval life, the line between surviving and dying is thin as a blade, and you walk it every day, never quite sure which side you will find yourself on when the sun rises again. If anyone were ever to paint an honest picture of your classroom, it would not be a scene of eager minds and patient hands folded atop neat desks. It would be a muddy patchwork of fear, fatigue, and hunger, with children squeezed onto benches that creak beneath them, their faces marked by worry far older than their years. These are your pupils, the children of peasants, who come to you not with the luxury of curiosity, but with the resignation of those already schooled by suffering. Most mornings, You watch them file into your crude schoolhouse, boots caked with last night's rain, hair still tangled from sleep. Their eyes dart to the window, always keeping half their attention on the world outside. Some clutch rough scraps of slate or a stick of chalk. Others bring nothing but themselves, empty handed and empty bellied. There is no uniform, no sweet smell of fresh parchment, only the persistent odor of sweat, earth, and livestock. Their lives are governed by the fields. When the sun is up, they are expected to work, planting, weeding, tending sheep, fetching water. Their attendance at your lessons is tolerated, sometimes even encouraged, but only if it does not interfere with the endless cycle of agricultural labor. In the weeks of planting and harvest, your classroom thins until you are left with only the weakest or the least useful, the children considered too sickly or awkward to handle a plow. You notice it in their posture, the stoop of a back already bent by hours spent hauling wood or swinging a hoe. Their hands are rough, calloused, sometimes bloody from work that has no place for soft skin or idle fingers. The older children arrive with the sullen exhaustion of miniature adults, their dreams already ground down by the turning of the seasons. The younger ones sometimes try to listen, their attention flickering like candlelight, but even they are never far from the worries that rule their households. They are not, for the most part, slow or stupid. The world has simply left them no time for the luxury of learning. You try to teach them letters, to shape their lips around the foreign edges of Latin, but you can see how little it means to them. What good is the conjugation of amo, amas, amat, when the cows need milking, the roof leaks, and the grain stores are running low? What use is the story of Caesar's wars when their brothers are lost to fever and their fathers come home with empty hands? Sometimes, as you lecture, your words bounce off their tired faces and vanish into the musty air. You ask them to recite, and they stare at you with the blankness of those who have already learned too much about disappointment. A few try, stumbling over the syllables, earning a rare nod or a grunt of approval. Others barely whisper, as if hoping their silence might spare them further embarrassment. The brightest, occasionally, surprise you. A girl who can recite the prayers with perfect memory, a boy who solves a puzzle you thought was beyond him, but for every spark, there are 10 who fade into the background, beaten down by the weight of everything else they must carry. Discipline is always an issue. The old stories would have it that teachers rule by the rod and the lash, and it is true that you keep a switch near your desk. But mostly, you govern by negotiation and fatigue. You threaten and cajole, promise and plead. Sometimes, when a child is caught in a moment of rare mischief, stealing an apple, poking his neighbor with a stick, you are as likely to sigh as to scold. After all, who among you does not wish for a moment's escape? They bring their troubles with them, packed in as tightly as the lice in their hair. There are quarrels over bread and bruises earned at home. Some weep quietly, hoping no one will notice. Others erupt in sudden, senseless anger, as if their small bodies can no longer contain the injustice of it all. You try to help, sometimes with a gentle word, more often with the simple act of listening, but you know your power is small. You cannot heal a festering wound, or conjure an absent father, or feed a hungry family. You can only teach. Some parents view your efforts with suspicion, believing that learning is a dangerous indulgence, a path to arrogance or heresy. Others see it as a last, desperate hope that perhaps, by some miracle, their child might escape the fate of generations. Rarely do they thank you. More often, they ask for favors. Can you teach their boy to read the priest's notices or help their girl with her sums? Can you find work for a clever child in the manor or intercede when a son is taken for the levy? You do what you can, but the village is a closed circle, and you are just another of its minor, powerless figures. And yet, there are small victories. A boy who once stumbled over his letters learns to sign his name. A girl, pressed into service in a nearby kitchen, returns one winter's day and thanks you for teaching her to count, explaining that now she can tell when the merchant is cheating her. These moments are rare, but you treasure them, like gold coins buried in mud, quickly lost, but never forgotten. You grow old watching these children grow older. Some survive, most do not. The faces change, but the anxieties do not. Every spring brings new pupils, new burdens, new sorrows to replace the old. You come to understand that in this place, education is not a path to freedom or greatness. It is simply another way to endure. You teach because you must, and they learn, if they learn at all, for the same reason. Outside, the fields call to them, and soon enough, your classroom will be empty again. The cycle will repeat as it always has. You gather your notes, take a deep breath of air tinged with smoke, and hope and resignation, and prepare for another day in the only world you and they have ever known. It is easy, perhaps, for those who read stories in grand halls by the light of crystal lamps to imagine that travel in your time is a sort of adventure, a romantic ordeal of heroic crossings, noble errands, and serendipitous discoveries. For you, the teacher of grammar in this mud choked world, travel is a necessity to be dreaded, an ordeal to be survived, not savored. The need to travel arises less from any grand design than from a series of unkind necessities. The local priest is ill, and the next village needs a scribe. A bishop's messenger passes through and demands a letter be copied. An old friend dies, and you are summoned to read the Psalms at his shallow grave. Or, more commonly, the crops have failed, the village grows suspicious, and you are sent away until someone remembers what you are for. Your journeys begin in trepidation. First, you must prepare a crust of bread, a hunk of cheese, if fortune smiles, a small flask of thin ale or watered wine, and your precious book of Latin prayers, though you know that should you be robbed, the bread is all they will want. You wrap these treasures in a ragged cloth, fasten your patched cloak at the neck, and pray the roads are dry. They never are. The so called roads are, in fact, little more than widened animal tracks, rutted and gouged by wagon wheels, churned to soup in the rains and baked to bone breaking hardness in the rare heat. Mud clings to your shoes and pulls at every step, so that after a day's journey, your legs ache and your feet are numb. The roads wind through forests that press close and dark, their branches tangling above, the undergrowth alive with the rumors of bandits and wolves. Even in daylight, you move quickly, glancing over your shoulder at every snapping twig. When you meet travelers, it is with suspicion first and relief only later. The common greeting is wary silence. Only when you have exchanged names and reassured each other that neither is likely to rob the other does the conversation grow warmer. You swap news, bad harvests, the latest deaths, rumors of war, or, more dangerously, heresy. If you are lucky, you travel together for a mile or two, safety in numbers. If not, you press on alone, ears straining for footsteps behind you. Nightfall brings a new set of dangers. You do not have the means for an inn. Those smoky, lice ridden places are reserved for merchants and minor nobility. Instead, you seek shelter where you can, in the corner of a barn, if the farmer is feeling charitable, under a hedgerow, if not. Sometimes you find a church whose priest will offer a place on the cold stone floor, the scent of incense mingling with the mildew. You share your bread with whatever small creatures happen by, wrap yourself tighter in your cloak, and hope the rain keeps its distance. Most nights it does not. Each morning you rise with stiff limbs and more aches than you began with. You brush dirt from your clothes and shake out the bugs that have taken up residence in your hair and sleeves. A cold, thin breakfast and a few muttered prayers. This is the sum of your comfort. You are reminded that the road is not only dangerous, but also deeply, endlessly uncomfortable. There are no soft beds, no baths, and certainly no moments of leisure. Your greatest fear on these journeys is not bandits or beasts, though they are real enough, but the sickness that travels with you. A single scratch can fester on the road, and a cough can turn to fever without the shelter of home. You pass villages marked by the pall of recent plague, their fields untended, their houses shuttered and silent. Sometimes you are greeted at the village edge by wary eyes and sharpened sticks, as if your very presence might summon old ghosts. Should you manage to reach your destination, your welcome is uncertain. You are greeted as a stranger, and in the countryside, that is a dangerous thing to be. The villagers may eye your thin cloak and battered satchel, wondering what secrets you bring, what curses or misfortunes might follow you. You must speak carefully, with the practiced humility of a man who knows his station. A misstep, a word too clever, or a glance too proud, and you might find yourself sleeping in a ditch, or, worse, running for your life from a mob convinced you have brought the pox with you. And always, in the back of your mind, is the knowledge that you must make the same journey home if you are lucky enough to have one to return to. Home, such as it is, with its leaking roof and drafty corners, becomes a place of longing. You think of your familiar straw bed, your old pot for boiling gruel, your small stack of books. You imagine yourself not as a traveler on great adventures, but as a stubborn weed clinging to a patch of earth, unwilling or unable to be uprooted. Travel in this age is not a story of maps and quests. It is a parade of blisters, mud, fear, and uncertainty, a process in which every step forward is another reminder of how tightly the world grips you, how little it wants you to wander far from your appointed misery. You trudge onward, counting your blessings in dry bread and quiet nights, never quite forgetting that the only true comfort is to survive long enough to return. In your world, religion is not merely a belief or a private comfort. It is the iron framework that surrounds and shapes every aspect of your existence, the ever watchful eye that peers through cracks in the wall, the echo that follows your footsteps through the muck. For you and for your pupils, religion is less a matter of personal faith and more an intricate web of rituals, superstitions, and prohibitions, an inescapable presence that both binds and suffocates. You wake to the distant clang of the church bell, a dull sound that seeps through fog and smoke, reminding the village of its place in the order of things. Morning prayers, midday prayers, evening prayers. The rhythm of the day is set not by the sun, but by the tolling of that cracked old bell. The priest, a gaunt man with a voice like gravel, is both shepherd and warden. He patrols the village, inspecting souls for signs of heresy or laxity, reporting all to distant authorities whose names you know only from whispered rumors. Your own role as a teacher is inextricably tied to the church. You are both servant and suspect, expected to impart the basic prayers, the catechism, the correct forms for crossing oneself and bowing one's head. You are to teach the children that the world is a place of trial, that suffering is the natural state, and that joy, if it exists at all, is best postponed until the next life. You are also to watch for signs of rebellion. A child who questions too freely, who jokes about the saints, who fails to kneel at the right moment. It is your duty, or so you are told, to guide them back to the narrow path, sometimes with words, sometimes with the switch. The rituals themselves are endless, tedious, and, if you are honest, faintly ridiculous. There is the weekly procession around the fields in which you and your students trudge after the priest, muttering Latin phrases that even you struggle to pronounce, scattering holy water onto crops that have never heard of salvation. There are feast days and fast days, vigils and masses, blessings for the livestock, exorcisms for the wells, and prayers for everything from rain to relief from lice. At each event, you stand at the edge, half participant, half spectator, watching as the village submits to the slow grind of tradition. There is little room for freedom in any of this. Your lessons are not your own. They are dictated by the church, reviewed by the priest, occasionally audited by some traveling deacon whose disapproval can mean a week's worth of skipped meals. Your few books are precious not only for their contents, but for their safety. They have all been approved, checked, and blessed. Anything suspect, a scrap of poetry, a riddle, a tale from before the current priest's time, must be hidden or, if discovered, quickly burned. The children's questions must be steered always back to the safe, narrow path of doctrine. You teach grammar, yes, but only the grammar of submission. At times, you envy the animals in the fields. Their world is brutal but simple. Eat, survive, reproduce, die. Your world is layered with invisible rules, secret fears, and obligations that must never be questioned. You are told when to work, when to eat, when to fast, when to confess, when to repent. Even your sleep is haunted by the fear of dreams that might be interpreted as signs of spiritual danger. You have learned to keep your own doubts silent, sharing them only with the wind or, in moments of weakness, with the occasional sympathetic fellow teacher, though even that is risky. The walls have ears, and the priest's sermons grow more pointed with every heretic burned in the next shire over. Your students absorb this atmosphere of anxiety as easily as they do the lice in their hair. They are taught, as you were, that questioning is a sin, that obedience is the highest good, that suffering is to be embraced, not escaped. They cross themselves at every sound, whisper prayers to saints for lost sheep and missing pennies, and grow silent at the mention of the devil's name. The girls are taught to keep their eyes lowered, the boys to keep their voices down, and all to confess not only their own sins, but those of their neighbors. Sometimes you wonder what is left of you under all these layers of fear and ritual. Are you the man you might have been if left to your own devices, or just a vessel for other people's rules? You try to remember a time before the church shaped every hour of your life, but the memory is as dim as the light in your classroom on a rainy day. It is easier to submit, to perform the rituals without thought, to mouth the prayers and mark the holy days as if your survival depends on it, because in truth, it does. There are moments, rare and perilous, when the mask slips. A child stumbles over the Latin words for peace or mercy, and you find yourself wondering if these concepts exist anywhere except on the page. You catch yourself longing for something more, freedom, perhaps, or even just a moment of unguarded laughter. But such moments are fleeting, quickly snuffed out by the watchful gaze of the priest or the suspicious looks of your neighbors. In the end, you return to the rituals, to the endless cycle of prayers and penance, because to do otherwise is to invite disaster. The church may offer salvation in the next world, but in this one, it offers only order, and even that is a blessing of sorts. You mark the days by the calendar of saints, teaching your pupils that their greatest hope is endurance, their highest ambition is obedience. You light your candle, recite the prayers, and prepare your lesson for the morning, knowing that the walls, the eyes, the rituals, and the rules will still be waiting for you when the sun rises again. If you ever imagined, as a child learning your letters by candlelight, that the rulers of your world might look down with gratitude upon those who labor to drag on others from ignorance, You were mistaken. Your king, your lord, your local baron, they are names whispered on the wind, rumors wrapped in fear, distant powers whose interest in you and your classroom is fleeting at best and perilous at worst. You learn quickly and painfully that you are not a servant of justice or progress. You are a functionary, a tool, a forgettable instrument in the machinery of power. When the king sends messengers through the land, collecting taxes, levies, and news of rebellion, they do not stop to ask if the children can write their own names. When the local lord rides past your village, his retinue splashing mud onto your cloak, he may glance at you once coldly before turning his attention to the weightier matter of how many sheep the peasants have failed to tithe. Sometimes, in the dark of winter, the baron's reeve will knock at your door, not to thank you for your service, but to demand an account of how many able bodied men remain, or to press you into scribing a new inventory of the village's livestock and stores. You are expected to perform these duties swiftly and without question. If you object, you risk the ire of a man whose patience is measured in the width of his belt and the sharpness of his blade. The ruler's needs come first. Your needs, your hopes, your fatigue, they do not enter the calculation. It is not that the great men of the land despise you personally. They do not think of you at all. You are a creature of smoke and shadow, part of the background noise that accompanies the grumbling of peasants and the chanting of monks. When the Lord hosts a feast, your presence is neither required nor wanted. When famine comes, your hunger is no more important than the barking of the village dogs. When war threatens, you are expected to tally the bodies, count the grain, and keep quiet. Society at large, for its part, cares little for your struggles. If you vanished tomorrow, struck down by the pox, carried off by wolves, or simply run out by a mob in search of a scapegoat, there would be no song sung, no memorial carved, no prayers muttered beyond the rote duties of the priest. The world spins on without you, as it has for centuries. Your work is invisible, your sacrifices unremarked. On rare occasions, you are summoned to the manor house, where the steward eyes you with suspicion as you scrawl out a letter for some business the Lord cannot be bothered to manage himself. You write slowly, carefully, fearing that any mistake will be blamed not on the sender's illiteracy, but on your own supposed laziness or malice. The steward huffs and mutters, impatient for the ink to dry. You leave with nothing but a sore hand and a vague sense that you have narrowly avoided disaster. When the church or manor needs you, it is not to improve the lot of your pupils, but to serve as an intermediary between the rulers and the ruled, a thankless and dangerous position. You are the bearer of unwelcome news, the reader of incomprehensible edicts, the writer of lists that will lead to new burdens for those who already have too many. No one thanks the messenger, especially when the message brings new taxes or harsher rules. You are, in short, useful only so long as you remain unnoticed. The best you can hope for is to blend into the scenery, to do your work quietly, to avoid drawing attention to yourself or your classroom. Ambition is a risk, pride, a provocation. Even the priest, your supposed ally, reminds you to keep your head down, to be humble, to serve without expectation of reward. There are days when the indifference of those above seeps into your bones, leaving you colder than any winter wind. You watch your pupils struggle with their lessons, knowing that none of them will ever be invited to dine at the manor table or to plead a case before the king. You wonder if any of this matters, if the slow, painful effort of teaching will change anything in a world where power and privilege are hoarded like bread during a famine. The answer, of course, is no. You are not here to change the world. You are here to endure it. The rulers will rule, the peasants will toil, and you will teach, as you have always taught, in the cold shadow of indifference. On your best days, you find solace in small victories. A child who learns to read a single word, a parent who thanks you for a kindness remembered. On your worst, you envy the beasts of the field, whose only obligation is survival, and so you move through the days, unseen by the powerful, unvalued by the masses, doing your work not for glory or recognition, but because to stop would be to vanish altogether, a ghost among ghosts, in a world too busy to notice its own shadows. You might imagine that the chief task of a medieval teacher is to impart knowledge, to open up the minds of the young like spring buds unfolding in the gentle sun. But that, you would soon discover, is the sort of fantasy reserved for those who have never set foot in your classroom. Your daily labor is not the work of planting seeds in fertile soil. It is more like carving letters into stone with your bare hands, while the stone resists you at every turn. The very tools of your trade are in themselves sources of daily anguish. You have no abundance of supplies. Your classroom is not lined with shelves of parchment and quills, no neat stacks of exercise books waiting to be filled. You teach with what you have, which is almost nothing. Every scrap of paper is precious, hoarded and reused until the ink runs together in a miserable stew of ghosts and stains. You cut your own quills from goose feathers, never wasting a single one, and guard your bottle of ink as if it were the blood of a saint. When your pupils arrive each morning, they bring with them a tragic inventory, a piece of broken slate, a stub of chalk so small it must be pinched painfully between thumb and forefinger, a bit of charcoal rescued from the hearth. Some children come with nothing but a hopeful look and dirt under their fingernails, and for them you improvise, drawing letters in the mud or in the air itself, hoping they will remember long enough to repeat the motions at home with a stick and a patch of dust. Even when materials are available, they are often woefully inadequate. The slates are cracked, the chalk crumbly, the pages torn and stained with grease. Your own books, the pride of your tiny profession, are battered things. Pages mended with thread and wax, margins filled with the scrawls of long dead teachers, and text so faded it sometimes takes minutes to decipher a single line. If you have a primer in good repair, it is because you have hidden it well from the curious hands of your pupils and the covetous eyes of the priest. There is no standard curriculum, no clear path from ignorance to learning. You teach what you can when you can, and hope that some of it takes root. One day you drill them on the alphabet, the next on the Lord's Prayer, the next on counting and sums. Latin is required, but few ever grasp more than a handful of phrases. You have become a master of repetition, of turning every lesson into a chant, every chant into a lesson, in the vague hope that through sheer monotony something might stick. Yet the true obstacles are not material, but human. The children themselves are tired, distracted, and weary. Their minds are full of hunger and fear, of chores waiting at home, of siblings to tend, and animals to feed. It is not that they lack the capacity for learning, it is that they lack the luxury of leisure, the freedom to focus on anything but immediately related to survival. You might spend an hour coaxing one boy through the first lines of a psalm, only to lose him for a week to an outbreak of fever or a family emergency. Worse, the parents are often suspicious. Many see education as a dangerous distraction, a temptation to idleness or rebellion. They do not thank you when their children return home with ink stained hands and new questions on their lips. More often, they grumble that the boy has forgotten how to mend a net, or the girl has spoiled her bread through daydreaming. You must tread carefully, never pushing too hard, lest the whole endeavor be cut short by a word from an irritated father or a pious mother convinced you are sowing seeds of heresy. You yourself are not immune to frustration. You have dreamed at times of discovery and inspiration, of a pupil whose mind lights up like a candle, whose learning outpaces your own. Instead, you are met each day with blank stares, with rote recitations that sound more like spells than sentences, with the grinding awareness that most of what you teach will be forgotten before the next season's harvest. In the rare moments when a student does shine, when a girl learns her letters, when a boy solves a sum, there is no audience for your pride. No one celebrates these victories but you, and sometimes the child's own quiet smile. There are no prizes, no gold stars, no letters home, just a little less darkness, a little more hope, easily swept away by the hard realities of hunger, sickness, and toil. Still, you persist. You rewrite the same lessons, mend the same books, clean the same slates, and begin again. You improvise with sticks and mud, with memory and patience, with whatever is left at the end of a hard year. You measure progress not in leaps, but in grudging, uneven steps, a name learned, a letter remembered, a prayer recited without error. As night falls, you set aside your broken tools and watch the last of the light fade from your window. You wonder what will remain of your efforts when you are gone, whether your lessons will echo in these children's lives, or be swept away by the same tide of hardship and indifference that has shaped your own. You suspect, in your more honest moments, that the world will hardly notice. Yet you return each morning to your cold classroom, ready to face another day of teaching with almost nothing, because almost nothing is all that is given to you. If any comfort can be found in your small, drafty classroom, it is not in the easy smiles of your students or the gentle exchange of questions and answers. Here, education is no gentle garden, it is a grim battleground, and discipline is not a philosophy, but a necessity enforced by splinters and bruises. The idea of inspiring curiosity seems laughable. Instead, you cling to order by the fingernails, knowing that the line between lesson and chaos is thin and easily crossed. The first law of your classroom is survival, yours and theirs. Your switch, cut fresh from the willow or hazel, lies across your desk not as a symbol, but as a tool you must use. It is not that you delight in punishment, but that without it, your words would be drowned in a sea of noise and quarrels. There is no time or space for gentle negotiations. These children have known only the stern voices of parents and the quick blows of daily life. They do not expect fairness, they expect authority. When a child misbehaves, snatches bread from another's hand, whispers crude jokes, or simply refuses to recite, you begin with a warning, a raised eyebrow, a cold stare, sometimes a sharp word. If that fails, the switch comes down across knuckles or shoulders. You learn quickly that discipline must be immediate and impersonal. You strike as the blacksmith strikes the anvil, firm, with purpose, and without apology. Yet, even as you wield your power, you know how little control you truly possess. The classroom is a room full of small, restless bodies, their muscles twitching with hunger, their thoughts forever half on chores, half on fear. If you lose their attention for a moment, the spell breaks and the room collapses into a scramble of noise and bickering. Order is not a state you achieve, but a balance you endlessly chase. Your harshness is mirrored in the wider world. These children are no strangers to pain. The field, the hearth, the street, they all teach lessons as sharp as any rod. Bruises bloom on arms and legs from work and accident, and your punishments rarely draw more than a sniffle or a sullen glare. In a world where hunger is constant and kindness is rare, there is little room for softness. To show weakness would be to invite not respect, but contempt or pity, both equally useless. You know that your reputation walks before you. Parents whisper that you are too strict, too quick to punish. Yet in the same breath, they remind their children that if they do not learn their lessons, worse awaits at home. The priest approves of your firmness. He too believes that discipline is the path to salvation, that young souls must be bent before they can be straightened. You do not argue. The cost of questioning authority, you have learned, is far greater than the discomfort of wielding it. There are, of course, those children who challenge you, boys with fire in their eyes, girls who defy with stubborn silence. They test the boundaries, pushing you to see how much you will tolerate before the switch is used. Sometimes, in private moments, you admire their spirit. You remember being young once, before the weight of discipline bent your own back, but you do not indulge them. You cannot afford to. The classroom is not a place for rebels. Here, order is survival, and survival leaves little room for dreams. The rituals of punishment are familiar. A boy sent to the corner, a girl made to stand with arms raised until they tremble, a group assigned to copy prayers until their fingers ache. You do not take pleasure in it, but neither do you flinch. You cannot. If your authority fails, so does the fragile order of the classroom, and with it, whatever thin thread of learning might reach these children through the fog of their hardships. After a day of lessons and discipline, you sit alone, the switch still across your knees. Sometimes your hands shake, not from guilt, but from exhaustion. You wonder if you have gone too far or not far enough. In your rare dreams, you imagine a world where learning is not wrung from fear, where laughter does not sound like defiance, where the lessons you teach are met with curiosity, not resignation. But this is not that world. Here, the line between discipline and cruelty is faint and often crossed, if only to keep from drowning in the noise and chaos. You tell yourself that you are not cruel, that your sternness is a kind of mercy, a shield against the harsher punishments that await your pupils outside your classroom. The world will not be kind to them. Perhaps it is better they learn that lesson early. Sometimes, after the last child has left, you catch a glimpse of yourself in the warped metal of your ink pot, your mouth set in a grim line, your eyes heavy with the day's burdens. You look like the very men and women who once frightened you as a child, and for a moment you wonder when exactly you became them. The answer is as simple and sad as the world around you. It happened slowly, one day at a time, one lesson at a time, one blow at a time, until you realized there was no other way to hold the line. In the dim twilight, you tidy your desk, set aside the switch, and prepare for another morning. The work is not noble, nor is it kind, but it is all the world allows. And so, the next day, you pick up the switch again and try for another hour to keep order, knowing that in this classroom and in this life, mercy and discipline are often two names for the same hard necessary thing. In your small, muddy world, sin is everywhere. The priest thunders about it from the pulpit. Parents mutter about it over thin stews and broken bread. You yourself are forced to track it like a hound, always sniffing the air for its presence among your pupils. The church insists that every failing, every lapse in discipline, is more than simple mischief. It is a symptom of something deeper, something rotten that must be named and rooted out, lest the whole village fall to ruin. Your classroom, then, is less a place of learning than a kind of spiritual battlefield. You are not only a teacher, but an amateur inquisitor, peering into the souls of children for hints of the wickedness they can barely name. Each offense, each muttered curse, each eye rolled at a prayer, each yawn during catechism is a sign of rebellion, not just against you, but against God. The world is obsessed with sin, and you are expected to be its ever vigilant warden. Punishments are part of the ritual. They are meant to drive out the devil, to bring about repentance, to save these small souls from the fire waiting on the other side of the grave. Sometimes the punishments are simple: a sharp slap to the back of a hand, a few hours kneeling on cold stone, copying out psalms until the ink smudges from tired tears. Other times, the punishments grow heavier, shaped by a fear that if you do not act, something worse will befall you all: a failed harvest, a sick cow, a death in the night. You recite the catechism daily, not just as a lesson, but as a shield. You drill the children on the seven deadly sins, on the horrors of pride, envy, gluttony, and the rest, until the words are little more than sound, syllables beaten flat by repetition and fear. Yet you see, even in their compliance, the small rebellions: a boy who will not lower his gaze, a girl whose lips do not quite move with the rest. You wonder sometimes whether you are driving sin out or simply teaching them to hide it better. Sin is not only the children's burden, it is your own too. You know the taste of resentment, of envy, of the small hatreds that simmer in your belly as you watch the priest's fat hands snatch the choicest food at feasts, or the Lord's men ride past without a glance. You recognize your own sloth in the days when your lessons fall flat, when you go through the motions with little hope or passion. You feel your pride bristle when a child questions your authority, your anger rise when you must beg for more ink or a new pair of shoes. You too kneel in confession, and though the priest absolves you, the stains never quite wash out. The village is a place of constant judgment, where every misstep can be magnified by gossip and suspicion. A child who stumbles in his prayers is whispered about for weeks. A family who suffers a run of bad luck is soon rumored to be hiding a curse, or worse, a heretic. You have seen children blamed for the death of a cow or a failed rain, their lives weighed down by suspicion heavier than any actual sin. Sometimes, desperate for some sense of control, you find yourself doing the same, searching for a scapegoat, eager to believe that misfortune can be explained, that suffering has a cause. You deliver punishments because it is expected, because the world demands evidence of order, of vigilance. Each blow, each harsh word is a small sacrifice to the ever hungry God of discipline and control. Sometimes, in the quiet of night, you wonder what it does to the children, whether you are teaching them to fear sin or simply to fear you. You worry that they will grow up twisted by shame, as you have, always wary of the invisible tally of faults being kept somewhere above. And yet, you carry on, because the system is bigger than you, and to refuse it would be to invite suspicion, or worse, punishment of your own. You whisper sometimes your own confessions into the darkness. I am tired. I am angry. I do not always believe. But the darkness, like the priest, offers no comfort, only silence, and the knowledge that tomorrow you will rise and do it all again. There are rare moments when you see a kind of mercy, when a child helps another up, or shares a scrap of bread, or whispers a word of comfort to a classmate in disgrace. These moments sting because they remind you of the tenderness that the world has almost stamped out. You wonder if, by teaching so much about sin, you have left too little room for grace. In the end, you become both jailer and prisoner, punishing sin because you fear the world will collapse if you do not. You dream of forgiveness, but in your waking hours, you wield punishment because in this time and place, that is the only language anyone understands. And so the cycle continues: sin, confession, punishment, forgiveness, all wound together in a never ending dance. You play your part, not because you believe in its justice, but because to stop would be to invite chaos and perhaps your own condemnation. Despite everything, the mud, the hunger, the discipline, the constant specter of sin, there are moments, small and easily missed, where life feels almost bearable. In these rare pockets of time, you remember that even in a world ruled by hardship, a stubborn sort of joy can still take root. You find these moments not in the grand events of the village, but in the small, nearly invisible details that flicker at the edges of each day. It might be in the way sunlight finally pierces the gloom, casting a warm patch on your desk where you can rest your tired hands, or in the odd, quiet calm that sometimes settles over your classroom in the late afternoon when the last of the children have gone and the only sound is the soft scratching of your own quill as you copy another psalm, the rhythm soothing after a day of noise. Sometimes, in the depth of winter, you share a weak, steaming cup of ale with the priest, both of you silent, staring into the fire as if it might show you a world beyond the smoke. There is a truce in these moments, a kind of mutual recognition that you are both trapped by the same rules and miseries. You talk, if you talk at all, about the weather, about the coming feast days, about the occasional rumor from the manor, but often you simply sit, and the silence itself is a gift, a respite from the endless need to instruct, to discipline, to explain. On better days, when the sun is high and the air almost sweet, you sometimes find yourself wandering the edge of the fields after lessons. The wildflowers push up through the ruts, careless and defiant, and for a moment you can almost believe the world is generous. You watch the crows swoop and quarrel, the village dogs bark at nothing in particular. The children chase each other in games so old no one remembers the rules. In these fleeting seconds, you see something in their faces that is not fear or exhaustion, but laughter. It startles you, and you turn away quickly, as if you have witnessed something private and sacred. There is satisfaction, too, in the routine of the day, a satisfaction born of survival, of small things accomplished. You take a certain pride in the neatness of your handwriting, the slow improvement of a pupil who finally remembers his letters, the rare praise of a parent who notices her child can recite a prayer without stumbling. These are not triumphs that will be sung or remembered, but in a world where most efforts vanish into the mud, they are victories all the same. Sometimes you even manage to find warmth in memory. On stormy evenings, when the wind rattles the shutters and the darkness seems alive with old ghosts, you remember a story told by your own teacher, a riddle shared in the flickering candlelight, or a piece of nonsense Latin that once made you laugh so hard you nearly spilled your ink. These memories are like hidden coins pulled from the bottom of a dusty chest, unexpected and valuable proof that life has not always been so hard, or at least that you have not always noticed. There are pleasures in the senses, too, even in their most meager forms. The taste of a fresh apple, somehow overlooked at harvest. The first swallow of thin, hot broth after a string of cold, hungry days. The faint, clean scent of rain after weeks of dust and dung. You savor these things greedily, knowing how quickly they pass, how seldom they return. Occasionally, you and the other teachers gather, those who are close enough to visit, at any rate, which is not often. These meetings are never festive, exactly, but there is a rough camaraderie in the sharing of complaints, a brief relief in the knowledge that others face the same impossible tasks. You trade tricks for stretching ink, for calming angry parents, for smuggling a joke into a lesson without being caught by the priest. The laughter in these moments is tired but genuine, a thin flame held against the vast, indifferent dark. Of course, these joys are fleeting, fragile, easily crushed by the next bad harvest or outbreak of fever. You do not expect them to last. You have learned better than to trust in happiness, but they are yours, and for as long as they linger, you cling to them with all the stubbornness you can muster. It is perhaps the greatest irony of your life that, in a world designed to grind down hope, it is the smallest things, the brief warmth of sunlight, the crooked smile of a child, the taste of bread that is not yet stale, that keep you from collapsing entirely. You gather these moments the way a miser gathers coins, knowing that when the night grows cold and long, it will be these fragments of joy, and not the lessons or the prayers that see you through to the next day. And so, when the work is done, and the village lies silent under the stars, you sit by the embers of your fire and let yourself remember, just for a moment, that not everything in life is hardship. There is laughter, even here. There is beauty, even here. There is, if not happiness, then at least a stubborn will to survive. And sometimes, if the world is feeling very generous, a thin, surprising thread of joy. If there is any mark of distinction in your role as a teacher, it is this: you are among the very few in your world who spends time with books, even if most of those books are battered, grimy, and half devoured by mice. In theory, working with manuscripts should be a privilege, a taste of the divine, a brush with the immortal wisdom of ages past. In practice, it is another form of drudgery, made all the heavier by cold fingers and failing light. Your library is a grand name for a sorry collection, a shelf that bows under the weight of 6 books, 2 of which are missing their covers, and one whose binding has been replaced by a strip of old leather. Most are religious texts, and none are truly yours. They belong to the church or to the village, and you live with the quiet fear that if you damage them, lose them, or fail to return them, the consequences will be swift and unpleasant. There is little chance of acquiring new volumes. Each manuscript is worth more than a season's labor, and the chance of seeing a scribe at work inking fresh pages in elegant Latin belongs to another world entirely. Copying a manuscript is less a scholarly pursuit and more an act of endurance. You sit at your crooked desk, hunched over the battered pages, squinting by candlelight, or, more often, struggling with the changing light of day. In winter, your ink freezes in the bottle. In summer, your sweat smears the letters before they are even dry. Each quill is a gamble, too sharp, and it tears the page, too dull, and the words dissolve into a gray, illegible haze. You trim and retrim, fingers black with ink, knowing that the simplest mistake might ruin hours of work. The texts themselves are not always friendly. Some are copies of copies of copies, with errors multiplying like fleas in a blanket. A missing word, a garbled phrase, a margin note by a long dead predecessor. You learn to decipher not only the intended meaning, but also the ghosts of all those who handled the manuscript before you. At times, you find yourself arguing with them silently, correcting their mistakes while committing a few of your own. On the rare occasion you come across a bit of marginalia, a crude joke, a scribbled drawing, a desperate prayer, you feel a strange kinship with those long gone hands, a reminder that even in the dustiest corners of duty, a little humanity survives. The church's demands are unending. You are to copy prayers for the priest, lists for the reeve, notices for the manor. Sometimes an edict arrives from a distant authority, and you must render it into something the villagers can almost understand. You labor for hours over the words, careful not to miss a line, because the blame for any confusion will fall squarely on your shoulders. If the Latin is faulty, it is your fault. If the names are misspelled, it is your fault. If the news brings anger or fear, somehow it is your fault. You have heard tales of scriptoria in great monasteries where rows of monks labor in silence, their only distraction the slow tick of time and the gentle breath of the wind through the cloisters. You imagine what it must be to work in such peace, to have it all the tools you need, to know that your efforts might someday be read by eyes in distant lands. Instead, you work hunched and shivering, the world pressing in at every seam, rats nibbling at your feet, the shouts of children outside, the constant worry that the tallow candle will sputter out before you have finished your page. There are moments of satisfaction, even so. A well formed letter, a line that fits the margin exactly, a page free from smudges. These small triumphs matter, especially when so little else does. Sometimes you teach a pupil to copy a prayer and watch their hand, clumsy at first, begin to steady. You remember then that there is a kind of magic in the act of writing, a power to preserve words against the gnawing of time and oblivion. But more often, your work with manuscripts feels like an act of resistance against decay, a slow and losing struggle with the forces of damp, cold, and forgetfulness. You patch and mend, you scrape away mistakes with a knife, You press old pages flat under stones. You know, in your bones, that even these fragile efforts may not survive a single hard winter, let alone the judgment of history. At night, when your hands are stiff and your eyes ache, you set aside your work and wonder whether anything you have written will outlast you. You have no illusions of glory, no dreams of fame in future centuries. Your manuscripts are tools, and your job is to keep them alive for another day, another year, another generation. If you are very lucky, perhaps a line or two will survive in the margin of a book, a faint echo of your existence whispered into the indifferent dark. Still, you rise the next day, refill your inkwell, and begin again. The work is endless, tedious, and often thankless. But in a world that offers so little certainty, there is at least comfort in the slow, deliberate movement of pen on page, the small hope that somewhere in these fragile words, a trace of yourself may remain when all else is lost to mud and memory. In all the stories you have ever read, what few there are, pressed between sermons and psalms, solitude is painted as a kind of virtue, the proud badge of the wise. Yet for you, the grammar teacher, loneliness is less a choice and more an ever present condition, a cold weight pressing down with every dusk and dawn. It is not only the physical separation that marks your days, though there is plenty of that. Your room stands at the edge of the village, close enough to be summoned, but far enough to remain outside the swirl of daily life. In the evenings, when the doors are barred and the fires are lit, you hear laughter and quarrels from the peasant homes, the muffled warmth of families sharing what little they have. You listen to these sounds as an outsider, knowing your own small fire is for you alone. Even the rats have better company. You tell yourself you have chosen this path, that to be a teacher is to be apart, to keep your mind clear for higher things. But the truth is less noble. The villagers do not invite you to their tables unless a child is sick or a letter must be read. The other men drink together at the alehouse, exchanging news and curses in equal measure, but you remain the scholar, a figure somewhere between priest and stranger, trusted with secrets, but never with friendship. When you were young, you might have imagined the camaraderie of scholars, an exchange of ideas over bread and wine, laughter at clever jokes, the comfort of shared burdens. Instead, you find yourself speaking only to children who must listen and to parents who would rather not. Even the priest, who sits with you on winter evenings, keeps a careful distance. You suspect that he, too, is lonely in his way, locked within his own walls of ritual and suspicion, but the gap between your worlds is a moat that neither of you can cross. There are times when you long for the comfort of a confidant, someone to whom you could speak freely without weighing every word for fear of judgment or gossip. You watch the villagers, husbands and wives bickering, old friends quarreling, children fighting and then forgiving, and envy even their bitterness. To have someone who will argue with you is, in its way, to be known. You wonder if anyone will remember your voice when you are gone. The loneliness settles into your bones. It colors every meal, every lesson, every quiet hour spent copying prayers. You find yourself talking aloud to the fire, to your ink pot, to the occasional mouse bold enough to visit your desk. When you catch yourself doing it, you feel a sharp pang of shame, a reminder that the world has no room for those who talk to themselves. But the silence presses too heavily otherwise. Occasionally, you attempt to bridge the distance. You offer a smile, a joke, a kind word to a neighbor or a child. Sometimes it is received kindly, a grateful nod, a rare laugh, but more often it is met with suspicion or indifference. You do not belong, not truly. You are useful, yes, but always apart. There is a chill in this knowledge, one that no fire can quite dispel. There are other teachers in distant villages who know your plight. You see them once or twice a year at church festivals or when summoned by a visiting dignitary. These meetings are awkward and formal, each of you wary, careful not to reveal too much. After all, a misplaced word can turn a colleague into a rival, or worse, an informant. You share a cup of weak ale, exchange complaints about ink and pupils, and part with the uncomfortable sense that you are all drowning, each in your own muddy pond. Sometimes the loneliness is sharp, a blade in your chest when you see a family huddled together against the cold, or when a child runs to her mother after a long day of lessons, eyes bright with the promise of safety. Other times, it is dull and heavy, a constant ache that never quite fades. You busy yourself with work, with the endless chores of survival, but the emptiness waits for you at the end of every task. At night, you lie awake, staring at the shadows cast by your candle. You try to remember a time when you felt less alone, perhaps as a child, pressed close to your mother's side, or laughing with friends before the plague took them all. The memories are faint, blurred by years of solitude. You wonder if you are becoming less human with every passing season, if the loneliness is hollowing you out from within. Yet you endure, because what else is there? You rise each morning, prepare your lessons, greet your pupils with what warmth you can muster. You answer the knocks at your door, read the letters, copy the prayers. You fill your days with tasks, because to stop would be to feel the emptiness more keenly. You tell yourself that your work matters, that the words you teach will outlast you, that in some distant future a child will remember your name. It is a thin hope, but it is better than none. And so, the lonely grammar teacher continues, a silent figure at the edge of the village, watching the world from behind cold panes of glass, holding tight to the small, stubborn conviction that even the loneliest life can have meaning, if only in the act of enduring it. Perhaps nothing reminds you more often and more mercilessly of your insignificance than the weather. It is the ultimate master of all, the quiet tyrant of every plan and hope in your life and the lives of your students. The sun, the wind, the rain, and the endless grinding cold dictate the rhythm of your days, and there is nothing, absolutely nothing, you can do to change it. A dry spring, a wet summer, a winter that stretches its claws longer than memory. Each one carves its mark on the village and, by extension, on your classroom. The rain comes not as a gentle blessing, but as a persistent, driving force that turns paths into rivers, fields into sucking bogs, and every humble roof, including your own, into a leaky sieve. The schoolhouse, never well built to begin with, weeps from every beam. Your desk warps and splits. Your few precious books curl at the corners, and the children arrive soaked to the skin, leaving muddy footprints as they shiver at their benches. When it is cold, and it is cold for much of the year, your lessons are punctuated by chattering teeth, numb fingers, and the soft whimpers of children who can barely feel their toes. You wrap yourself in every garment you own, yet the chill finds its way in, burrowing into your bones. The ink in your pot turns sluggish. Your breath clouds the air with every word, and you wonder how any learning is possible in such a climate. Sometimes, just to keep warm, you make the children stand and recite their lessons, stamping their feet in rhythm, clapping hands until some feeling returns. It is less education than survival, and often not even that. But the rain and cold, for all their misery, are only part of the story. Drought is no kinder. A season of endless sun dries up wells and withers crops, cracks the earth until it looks as broken as the villagers who kneel to pray for relief. You see the effects in your students' faces, the thinness of their cheeks, the hollow shadows under their eyes, the growing silence as hunger claims what little energy they have left. Lessons falter, tempers flare, and even the most promising child can be undone by a season with too little to eat. The wind itself is a character in your story, a trickster, a thief, a mournful singer that rattles windows and carries news of far off storms. It howls through gaps in the walls, lifts the corners of your few papers, and snatches words from your lips. There are days when you shout to be heard above its constant moaning, and others when you huddle with your pupils in uneasy silence, waiting for the roof to hold or fail. Even on rare, still days, you eye the sky with suspicion, wondering what punishment it might hold in reserve. There is, of course, no question of resisting the weather. The villagers, your students' parents, read its signs as if it were a second scripture, clouds moving like armies, a ring around the moon, the smell of damp earth, or the warning crackle of frost in the air. They know, as you do, that the harvest depends on forces beyond anyone's control. A teacher's work is never more important than the state of the fields, and when the weather turns bad, lessons are the first thing to be abandoned. Attendance in your classroom rises and falls with the seasons. A stretch of clear days brings hope and a handful of children eager for the routine of learning. A week of storms, and you teach to half-empty benches, those who come so distracted by hunger, wetness, and exhaustion that you might as well be reciting your lessons to the mud outside. In the spring and autumn, when work in the fields is endless, you sometimes give up entirely, trading grammar for silence and the slow, anxious counting of days. Even travel, the rare necessity, becomes a test of courage and endurance. Mud sucks at your feet, snow blinds your path, and swollen rivers force you to wait or risk your life for the sake of a message or a borrowed book. You have learned painfully that even the smallest journey can be thwarted by a sudden storm or a path washed out by rain. You grow superstitious, as everyone does. You mutter prayers to forgotten saints for fair weather, leave crumbs on your windowsill as a bribe to whatever spirit governs the skies, and blame your failures, when you can, on the turn of the wind. If a lesson goes poorly, perhaps the weather is at fault. If a child falls ill, perhaps the damp is to blame. It is easier and sometimes kinder to curse the rain than to admit the deeper, slower rot of poverty and exhaustion. Still, there are rare, precious days when the weather is kind. A golden morning when sunlight warms the classroom, when children arrive with red cheeks and laughter, when lessons seem, if not easy, then at least possible. You cherish these moments, knowing how quickly they pass, how fickle the sky can be. For a few hours, you pretend that the world is not so harsh, that learning is more than an act of defiance against the elements. But the next cloud appears, the next cold wind rises, and the cycle begins again. You pull your cloak tighter, check the roof for leaks, and hope your ink will last through another wet season. You live by the weather's grace, or lack thereof, a small, shivering figure in a world where even the sky is an enemy. And so, you teach through rain and snow and sun, marking time by the passing of storms and the slow, uncertain return of spring. In your heart, you know that the weather will always win, but you fight on anyway because there is nothing else to do, and because even the smallest flicker of learning is a victory against the dark, indifferent sky. To teach a child to read and write, you have come to learn, is to do battle not only with ignorance, but with the entire weight of their circumstances. There is no magic moment, no sudden dawning of understanding, only the slow, punishing climb from darkness into a different shade of gloom, where even the smallest spark of literacy can flicker and vanish in the next gust of hardship. Your students, for the most part, arrive with no preparation. Letters are not something they see at home. There are no signs, no stories by firelight, no household records kept in a neat hand. For most families, words live only in the mouths of priests and the ink-stained hands of distant scribes. Even the simplest message from the manor or the church is a mystery, something to be feared or ignored. In this world, to be illiterate is not a shame. It is simply the natural order, another inheritance like calloused hands or bent backs. And so you begin each lesson at the lowest rung. The alphabet is not a song, but a struggle, a series of shapes to be memorized by sheer force, repeated until tongues grow thick and patience thinner. Some children learn a few letters, then forget them again the moment they are called away to fetch water or chase geese. You draw in the mud, Trace letters on battered slates. Recite over and over until the sounds lose all meaning. Sometimes weeks pass before a child can reliably tell one letter from another. Writing is another battle. Chalk and slate are precious, parchment almost unheard of, and your quills are worn to nubs. Children's fingers are stiff from cold or labor, clumsy with tools they have never used before. You teach them to hold the stylus, to shape each letter with care, to keep their lines straight. More often than not, the result is a muddle, scratches and blobs that barely resemble the neat columns of your own cramped script. You offer praise when you can, but the frustration is thick in the air, a shared defeat. And always there is the suspicion, sometimes spoken, sometimes only a glance from a parent, or the sneer of an older sibling, that this work is useless, perhaps even dangerous. What good is reading, they ask, if it does not put food on the table? What is the point of writing if the world is ruled by those who already have the power? You have no easy answers, only the stubborn conviction that there is value in the effort, that a mind opened even a little is less easily closed again. Progress is painfully slow. For every child who learns to read a prayer, 3 more struggle to remember their letters. Some give up entirely, called home by parents who see no reason to waste good daylight on lessons. Others attend only when weather or work allows, their skills fading between each brief, uncertain session. You try to keep hope alive, yours and theirs, but some days the burden feels too heavy, the goal too far. You watch as the youngest, most eager students lose their spark, ground down by hunger and fatigue. You see the brightest girls discouraged by mothers who remind them that books are not for women, the cleverest boys pressed into work before they can master their names. There are tears, sometimes anger, often resignation. You grieve for each loss, knowing that the world will not. For those who do persist, the rewards are meager and often invisible. A child who can read the Lord's Prayer is still bound to the field or the hearth, still subject to the same rules and punishments as the illiterate. Sometimes a boy is chosen by the church for further study, or a girl is praised for her neat script, but such victories are rare and never secure. More often, the skills you have struggled to impart become just another curiosity, another reason for the village to view your pupils with a wary eye, another difference in a world that prizes conformity above all. And yet, in spite of everything, there are moments that make the struggle worthwhile. A child's face lights up when they recognize a word for the first time. A student stumbles through a line of Latin, proud even in their awkwardness. An old woman comes to you in secret, asking you to teach her to sign her name so she can claim what is hers without a mark made by someone else. These moments are fleeting, almost swallowed by the gloom, but you hold on to them fiercely. At the end of each day, as you scrape chalk dust from your hands and close the battered door behind you, you wonder if it is enough. You think of all the letters forgotten, all the lines blurred by time and hardship, and you try to convince yourself that even a single word learned is a kind of victory, a fragile, flickering promise that the world might someday be more than mud and silence. You know, in your bones, that the odds are against you. But you teach anyway, because to do otherwise is to let the dark win, to accept that ignorance is the only inheritance your children will ever know. You teach not because you believe you can change the world, but because in the brief moments when a child writes their own name, you see a sliver of freedom, a glimmer, however faint, that something different is possible, if only for a moment. And so, lesson by lesson, letter by letter, you wage your slow, stubborn war against the darkness, knowing that every word matters, even if no one else believes it. You are supposed to be more than a teacher of letters and numbers. You are meant to be a gardener of souls, a shaper of morals, a guide to the virtues that, in theory, keep the world from collapsing into chaos. The church and the village both expect you to drill your pupils in right and wrong, in what it means to be good, and to do so with a confidence you do not feel and a certainty you do not possess. The irony is sharp. You, hunched and hollow eyed, trying to teach virtue in a world that barely remembers what the word means. Your own lessons in morality have come not from books or sermons, but from the hard, bruising school of experience. You have learned that justice is often a matter of who owns the land, that honesty is dangerous when food is scarce, that kindness is a currency traded sparingly and with suspicion. Still, you try. Each day, you recite the old stories, the fables and parables handed down from those who claim to know better. You tell the children about the righteous man who shares his bread, the honest woman who refuses to lie, the merciful soul who forgives a neighbor's debt. You watch as the words drift over your pupils like smoke. They are polite, and of course, but you see the doubt in their eyes. These are not tales for their world. In your classroom, morality is a lesson only so long as the lesson does not threaten survival. You tell a boy not to steal, but you know his family has not eaten properly in weeks. You preach the virtue of truth and then watch as the same child is beaten for admitting to a mistake. You teach forgiveness, but the villagers remember every old feud and slight, keeping score with a carefulness that puts the monks' best record keepers to shame. The church's teachings are everywhere, but their meaning is twisted by necessity and fear. The priest rails against greed and envy, then collects tithes with the zeal of a starving wolf. He thunders about the sanctity of marriage while winking at the widow with the fattest goose. You are told to instill obedience, but obedience often means accepting cruelty and injustice without complaint. Even the rituals meant to purify and heal, confession, penance, prayer, become tools of gossip, weapons for the powerful to wield against the weak. The children see through the cracks, as children always do. They know which lies are safe and which truths are dangerous. They learn to be silent when silence is expected, to echo the right phrases when the priest or their parents are listening, to save their real thoughts for whispered games in the shadows. They are clever, and you admire that cleverness, even as you mourn the price they pay for it. Sometimes a child asks you a question that cannot be answered safely. Why do the rich eat so well when the poor starve? Why does the priest get a new cloak while we patch ours again and again? You stumble through answers, talking of God's will, of patience and reward in the next life, all the while feeling the words crumble like stale bread in your mouth. You suspect they know you are lying, and you hate that you are forced to do it. You are not immune to compromise yourself. There are days when you turn a blind eye to a stolen loaf, when you fudge the records so a starving family can keep a little more. You know that mercy here must sometimes be quiet and unofficial, done in the shadows, away from the eyes of those who claim to love virtue most. You teach the rules, but you also teach the workarounds, the small kindnesses that can make life bearable, even if they break some greater law. You watch your students grow older, their faces hardening as they learn which parts of your lessons to remember and which to forget. The world shapes them more surely than you ever could. They learn that the greatest virtue is survival, that sometimes to be good is simply to endure without becoming entirely bitter or cruel. You wonder sometimes if you are teaching hypocrisy or if you are simply teaching the truth. In the privacy of your heart, you wish for a different world, one where honesty is rewarded, where kindness is not seen as weakness, where a child can grow up believing that virtue is something more than a trick for the powerful. But wishing does not change the mud in the streets, or the empty bellies, or the cold that creeps into every corner. At the end of the day, you sweep your classroom and set aside your books, telling yourself that you have done your best. You pray out of habit more than hope that your pupils will find some kind of goodness despite it all. Perhaps you think the greatest lesson is not the one you teach, but the one you struggle to believe. That even in a crooked, unjust world, there is still value in striving to be better, even if no one notices. You leave your classroom as the last light fades, watching the children run home, shouting, laughing, sometimes fighting, but alive. Their lives will be hard, and many will bend or break under the weight of it. But a few, perhaps, will remember your lessons and find in them a reason, however small, to be a little kinder, a little braver, a little more human than the world expects. In theory, virtue and wisdom are for everyone. In practice, your classroom is divided by an invisible line as old as the village itself. On one side, the boys, with their scraped knees and sullen faces, are told that learning, even a little, is a path to something more, perhaps a clerkship at the manor, or, with great luck, a place in the church. On the other, the girls sit in smaller numbers, eyes lowered, hands folded, brought not by hope, but by obligation or sometimes by accident. You are expected to teach them the basics, just enough reading to recite their prayers and enough counting to avoid being cheated in the market. Anything more is greeted with suspicion or outright scorn. The girls themselves sense it. They arrive later, leave earlier, are called away more often to help at home. Their lessons are interrupted by cries from younger siblings, demands from mothers, or the sudden need to tend a sick animal. Their education is a patchwork, always at the mercy of the needs of everyone else. The boys, for all their distractions and reluctance, are at least allowed the pretense that learning might change their lives. The girls are given no such promise. They know, as their mothers knew before them, that their days will be spent bent over wash tubs, tending gardens, nursing children. The letters they learn in your classroom will be used to read prayers for dead relatives, to tally eggs at market, perhaps, if they are very lucky, to sign their name at the bottom of a church register. Ambition, if it ever flickers in their eyes, is quickly stamped out by the world around them. You see the waste and feel the frustration. Some of your cleverest pupils are girls, a sharp mind, a quick tongue, a memory that holds every lesson as easily as breath. You want to praise them, encourage them, give them books and questions, and a future beyond the walls of the village. But you are hemmed in on every side by tradition, by the muttered warnings of parents, and the raised eyebrow of the priest. Too much learning is dangerous for a girl, they say. A woman's place is not in the church or at a desk. You know it is nonsense, but in this world, nonsense is the law. Sometimes you try to give a little more. You slip a girl an extra lesson, or let her copy a prayer she already knows by heart, just for the pleasure of the letters. You answer her questions quietly, away from the boys, careful not to attract the wrong kind of attention. Once you loaned a battered book of stories to a girl whose mother could read, a rare treasure. It came back wrapped in rags, the pages even more worn, but you saw the glow in her eyes. For a moment, she was not just a daughter, not just a future wife or servant. She was a student, full of possibility. But the village notices. A father comes to you, angry that his daughter is daydreaming and slow with her chores. A mother scolds you for putting strange ideas in a girl's head. Even other children join in, mocking a girl who knows too much, who uses words they cannot understand. The priest is the most dangerous. He preaches obedience, modesty, and silence for women, and any rumor of a girl who thinks too freely can bring trouble faster than any failing grade. You know the risks. Still, you do what you can, hoping that a little knowledge, once kindled, cannot be entirely snuffed out. Sometimes, a girl remembers her letters years later when she needs them most, signing a marriage contract, reading a recipe, calculating what is owed at market. These are small victories, hidden and uncelebrated, but you cherish them. They are proof that your efforts are not entirely wasted, even if no one else sees their value. The girls themselves are caught between gratitude and fear. They want to learn, but they do not want to stand out, to draw the wrong kind of attention. You watch as they shrink into themselves, hiding their cleverness behind lowered eyes and silent obedience. Sometimes you see one of them break through for a moment, a quick answer, a flash of humor, but just as quickly she buries it again, knowing the cost of being different. You find yourself growing cautious, your encouragement wrapped in riddles, and praise given in secret. It is a strange kind of teaching, a slow planting of seeds you may never see grow. You wonder often what these girls might become in a world less cramped, less cruel. But your imagination is another luxury, one the village cannot afford. At the end of the day, you watch your pupils leave, boys racing and shoving, girls walking quietly together, eyes on the ground. You wish you could promise them more, that the world will change, that the doors you have nudged open will not be slammed shut again. But you know better. Here, tradition is as hard as stone, and change is measured in generations, not years. Still, you teach. You teach because you must, and because even the smallest chance at knowledge is worth the risk. You hope, in the quiet of your heart, that somewhere far away, in a future you will never see, a girl will remember your lessons, not just the words, but the secret permission to want more. There is no avoiding death in your world. It lurks behind every cough, every fever, every slip on an icy path, every poorly mended wound. Your classroom, for all its routines and rituals, is never free from its shadow. Each season brings losses, sometimes expected, sometimes sudden, always deeply felt, and rarely spoken of for long. You do not keep records, not truly, though you remember every face. There was Marta, who never missed a day until the pox came, her place empty, and the other children silent for a week. There was John, who learned to write his name just before he drowned in the swollen river one spring. There was Anselm, clever and bright, gone after a winter fever left him too weak to ever return. Their names linger for a while, past in whispers, then fading, as new troubles crowd the village's memory. You learn to recognize the signs, the hollowed cheeks, the sullen quiet, the child who sits apart, eyes glazed and unfocused. A sudden absence, first for a day, then a week. Sometimes a parent comes to your door, red eyed but resigned, to ask that you pray for a child who will not recover. More often, you hear the news by rumor or from the priest, delivered with the same tired sigh as any other announcement of loss. There are no shrines, no memorials, just the hard fact that a space at the bench will remain empty. The village goes on because it must. There are too many mouths to feed, too many hands needed for the fields. Grief is a private thing, expressed in small ways. An extra candle at Mass, a mother pausing outside your door, her hand pressed to her lips, unable to speak the name of the one she has lost. You try to carry on as usual. Lessons continue, prayers are recited, new pupils appear to fill the gaps left by the dead. But you notice how the group draws in on itself, how laughter dims, how questions go unasked. Children grieve differently, sometimes in silence, sometimes with sudden bursts of anger or tears. You do what you can, but there are no words to soften the blows. In your world, death is not a tragedy, but an expected guest, always at the edge of the room. There are days when you cannot help but wonder if your teaching has any meaning at all in the face of such relentless loss. What use is a prayer learned, a letter copied, when the child who learned them will not see another spring? The other adults tell you to be practical. The harvest must be gathered, the chores must go on. But you find yourself brooding, haunted by all the unfinished lessons, all the lives that ended just as they began to open to the world's possibilities. The church offers explanations, God's will, the promise of paradise for the innocent. But you find these words as thin and cold as the wind in your classroom. You say the prayers because it is your duty, but you know that no amount of Latin can bring a child back from the grave or ease the ache in a parent's heart. You watch as your pupils repeat the same rote answers, their voices low, their faces closed. For some, faith is a comfort. For others, it is another part of the daily routine, a habit that dulls rather than heals. Sometimes the deaths come so quickly that you barely have time to remember the living. A fever sweeps through the village, and for weeks you teach only the strongest and luckiest, the others confined to beds or carried out to shallow graves behind the church. The priest's bell tolls so often that its sound fades into the background noise of daily life, like the barking of dogs or the creak of your door. The gravedigger becomes a familiar figure, shoveling quietly as he works, pausing only to cross himself before moving to the next mound. You grieve in your own way. After a child dies, you find yourself lingering over their work, a scrap of writing, a half finished drawing, a slate covered in hesitant letters. You keep these tokens for a while until practicality or fear of suspicion forces you to throw them into the fire. Still, you remember a crooked smile, a clever answer, a voice raised in laughter. In these small memories, you try to find some meaning, some reason to keep teaching. But the village is relentless, and your own life is too precarious for prolonged mourning. Soon enough, new faces fill the empty places. New children begin the slow struggle to learn, and the old losses slip into memory, replaced by new worries, new sickness, new hunger. You have learned painfully that in this world, love and loss are inseparable. You care for your pupils, knowing that many will not survive, that their lives will be short and hard. Yet you do it anyway, because the alternative, indifference, is a kind of death all its own. You hope quietly that for those who live, the lessons will linger, that something of your care will survive the endless winter, the next fever, the next accident. As the seasons turn and the benches fill and empty again and again, you grow older, your own hair thinning and your hands shaking, but still you teach. You do not expect gratitude or remembrance. In the face of death, your only victory is persistence, a stubborn refusal to let the darkness win entirely, a belief that even the briefest life can hold a spark of meaning, however small. And so you continue, mourning and teaching, teaching and mourning, caught in the endless cycle of loss and hope that is the only rhythm your world allows. The years pass, and with them go pupils, seasons, and the last of your illusions. You sit by the dim, flickering light of a tallow candle, listening to the wind worrying at the walls, and consider what remains of a life spent scratching at the stubborn surface of ignorance and hardship. There are no monuments for teachers like you, no songs or stories passed down by grateful generations. Your legacy, if it can be called that, lies in memories already fading, lessons half remembered, a handful of words scrawled on slates now ground to dust. You understand now, if you did not before, that you are a background figure in the slow, churning flow of history, a piece of grit ground down by the same pressures that wear at every life in the village. You do not decide what matters. The tides of war, famine, and plague wash over you as they do over everyone else, indifferent to your small acts of instruction and discipline. Your attempts at order and meaning are quickly swallowed by the next disaster, the next harsh winter, the next death or birth or shift in the Lord's whim. Sometimes you imagine that the grand chronicles, the ones written in fine hands for noble patrons, might someday mention your existence. In this year, a teacher in a small village taught the children to read. But you know better. Your work is invisible, your name unrecorded. You are a shadow in the margins, a line easily smudged out. The best you can hope for is that a pupil somewhere will whisper a prayer for you when you are gone, or that a line you copied will survive, if only for another generation. You wonder if anything you taught truly mattered. Did the children remember their prayers? Did any of them write a letter years later, stumbling through the alphabet you drilled into them? Did a single lesson help someone count coins fairly or recognize their own name in a contract? Or did all your efforts vanish the moment the ink dried, the slate was wiped clean, the hunger or fear returned to claim their full attention? You suspect it is a little of both. In rare moments, you see glimpses of your influence. A young man reciting a prayer at a burial, a mother reading a list of goods at the market, a girl quietly signing her name on a church record. These are tiny victories, fragile and often unnoticed, but real nonetheless. They are the closest thing to immortality your world offers. You hold them close, even as you watch the years slip through your fingers. Mostly, though, you see how little you could change. The village goes on as it always has, struggling, surviving, grieving, forgetting. The fields are planted, harvested, and left fallow, the cycle repeating itself as it has for generations. New teachers come, old teachers go, and the faces at the benches blur together in the half light of memory. You realize that you too are replaceable, a gear in a machine that cares nothing for who turns the wheel. There is a kind of freedom in this knowledge, bitter though it is. You learn to let go of pride, to do your work for its own sake, not for recognition or reward. You accept that suffering is your constant companion, that hope is a thin gruel, that joy is found in scraps and fragments. You become adept at finding meaning in routine, in the sharp smell of ink, the feel of a well-cut quill, the moment when a child's eyes flicker with understanding, however briefly. As your strength wanes and your hair whitens, you grow quieter, less inclined to argue or instruct. You watch the village as an old dog watches a familiar path, fondly, but without illusion. You know the stories that circulate about you: the strict teacher, the odd recluse, the scholar with ink stained fingers and a tired frown. Perhaps, somewhere, there is a hint of affection in these tales. Perhaps not. It hardly matters. In the end, your death will be as unremarkable as your life. The priest will say the prayers, the villagers will bow their heads, and the world will continue its ceaseless turning. Someone else will take your place, another teacher, another figure at the edge of the crowd, reciting the same lessons, facing the same defeats, and the same small, stubborn victories. Yet for all the bleakness, there is a grim comfort in your role. You have done what you could, held the line against the dark, given what little you had to give. In a world that is mostly suffering and silence, you have managed to carve out a space for thought, for words, for the fragile persistence of memory and meaning. That is no small thing, even if no one but you knows it. So you gather your books, your broken quills, your worn memories, and prepare each day, each year, for as long as you are able, to teach again. Your life may be only a shadow on the wall, but it is a shadow that stood between ignorance and the end of things, for just a moment, in a world that would rather forget. And in the final hush before sleep, as the candle guttered and the night crept in, you let yourself believe, if only for a heartbeat, that you mattered, if not to history, then to a handful of children, to a fleeting, fragile moment of hope in a hard, unyielding world